I have designed the course in a way that enables us to run through the most important thinkers and actors on the stage of Indian history, let's say, in the 20th century. So the 20th century is my period, is the period that I have. It's a long period, and it's a period of great events, no dearth of excitement over, in terms of activity, in terms of world historic sort of decisions making and confrontations on the national stage, and accompanying all of those, a lot of debate, a lot of thinking going into what exactly are we doing, what exactly is this thing called India that is our object, right? It's a period which, when you look back in retrospect at some of those events, you have to ask yourself questions both about who conceived this entity called India, how it came into existence in their minds, first of all, because as with many national movements, the nation is first conceived in the mind before it's actually brought to, into being in reality, right? And it was similarly the case, the same with India. It was conceived as something, and there was no agreement whatsoever about what this conception was, and what was there was no, it was not a consensual idea. There was conflict over this idea, right? And so you have and yet in time one idea has sort of triumphed over the other ideas, right? And so you have a situation of somewhat stable dominance of a particular idea of India, and corresponding to it a particular territory which goes by the name of India as a nation state, right? You have that. So that is what is the core content of this course. That is, the big thinkers, the big leaders of the national movement are really the people that I have chosen. So you have Gandhi, obviously a very major figure. You have Nehru, you have Ambedkar, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. You have Bhagat Singh, a very figure, a short-lived but very dramatic figure in Indian history. You have now some Rabindranath Tagore and so on, and debates between them. Sometimes independently they are thinking about India, and sometimes in exchanges between them also. There are some evidence for all of those things. And these are debates which cover a range of issues, all of them of great importance to the people of this place called India, right? So that is one. The second part is more recent material. So in other words, not the leaders, not the big thinkers, but the scholars, the writers and other filmmakers, etc., who have post-independence, right, after 47, in the last 60 years or so, how they have discussed their own past, the colonial past, as well as how they have commented on, criticized the nature of the new India that was established in 1950, right? So this is in that you will have the subaltern studies people, obviously, scholars, but also other story writers. I have included some work by writers, people who have commented on some of, in their own creative work, commented on some of the crucial issues. And I think we are, one of the issues that is very, very central to Indian life throughout the 20th century and even today is, of course, the question of religion. Right? It seems to not go away. We are always dealing with the question of religion. A second question is the question of caste. Again, a question that came up in the beginning of the colonial period in a dramatic way, and has ever since and even today remained a central social question, right? Yeah, these are some of the things. There are other questions. So, religion, caste, there is also the question of language, because India is also a place where every state has a different language, right? There are about a few states which share a language, but otherwise every state has its own state language. And then there is a language of the official language of the union. And then there is another colonial language which has still remained a very strong presence, retained a strong presence in India. That is the English language, which enables me to be here today in some, in some ways. So you have a very complicated linguistic sort of order. And a series of other things, education questions, the question of taking the colonial question, to taking the state as a question, is it the Indian state? To what extent is it a remainder from the colonial times? The colonial state has in some ways, in many ways, remained the same over, after the period of independence, after the achievement of independence. So that has been one of the sources of great critical engagement, saying what does freedom mean if it does not mean a dismantling of the old structure and a rebuilding of a new structure. These are again questions which feature in some of these writings that we are talking about, where for instance we will read Ranajit Guha talking about this idea of dominance without hegemony. So what is dominance? What is hegemony? Why is it that there is dominance but there is no hegemony? What kind of concept is that? Because we can understand how colonial India is about dominance without hegemony, because even though they were there for 150 years and even more, even longer if you count the earlier periods, the fact is that hegemony, they did not achieve hegemony. The British rule did not achieve a hegemonic presence in India. That's one proposition. It remained dominant because it could enforce the colonial rule, to govern the populations, keep them under control for a substantial period of time, but not necessarily convince the people that this is what is good for you, that this is actually what we want, right? So the question then, a crucial question becomes after independence, is the new state, is the Indian, free Indian state hegemonic? That is, has it convinced the people that this is, that, is there a consensus? It's saying, okay, this is our government and we are ruled by it. This is another question, right? So these are questions that we will, try and address with the help of these readings. So freedom, I decided to focus on the term freedom for a number of reasons, because freedom is well, it's at the heart of the entire 20th century process for India. Freedom, the freedom struggle, right? Achieving freedom from foreign rule is a question, right? So it becomes a question of defining this idea of freedom. What does it mean? So what constitutes freedom, right? So the different definitions of freedom, how freedom, and associated with it, the whole idea of decolonization. What does that mean? Can you actually decolonize? In what sense? Is in the economic sense? In some, is it in some sense of the psyche? Like, for instance, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the African writer, in his book proposes what is called the decolonizing the mind. What does that mean, to decolonize the mind? A project which obviously in India Ashish Nandi also has proposed, right? To decolonize, can you define it? Can you say ABC are the requirements for decolonized mind, and so on? So the questions of freedom are some of the questions that all of these questions, that the question of caste, of language, of region, of territory, of the state, of religion, all of these questions actually finally hinge around, for me at least, the way I define it, the question of freedom. So freedom. I mean, in a way, freedom is in many commentaries on Indian issues. People pointed out that there was no word for freedom like that. This idea of freedom. There are many words which you could use for it, but some will say there is no actual word for it, and so on. So this is also another question. Do you need to have word for it to be real for you, and so on, right? What does that mean? So the linguistic issue at that level, right, is another factor. Now, yes, the question of being colonized, being a colony, having emerged from the colonial experience, etc., is, I think, that it's not, there is a history of colonization here also, but it's a different history. And I hope that in some ways this experience, which is very different, the experience of colonization in this part of the world is very different in my opinion, but we could debate it. From the nature of the colonial experience that, say, a place like India or some of the other countries of Africa and elsewhere have gone through, this particular kind of colonization that the British Empire sort of executed in different parts of the world, and especially because it has that relation to the whole global questions of revolutions, modernity, right, enlightenment, and all of these ideas, which have a global sort of appeal, right? We all know that wherever we are constantly attracted by, every place in the world is attracted by, greatly attracted to these ideas of citizenship, equality, freedom, liberty, right? The idea that modern states should be run by some kind of democratic process rather than through monarchic or other totalitarian or dictatorial sort of regimes, right? That reason should prevail over the tutelage of some authority, right? Enlightenment thinking, etc. So you have all of these. So you have this contradictory phenomenon of a 20th century experience of colonized countries, which veers between the practical experience of domination right? Where there is a force which dominates, oppresses and exploits a population by using non-democratic, non-enlightened, authoritarian, patriarchal, and masculinist. These are some of the terms that have been employed. Ways, right, to dominate and to exploit, etc. And at the same time is the bearer of this message of enlightenment, of modernity, of democracy, of citizenship and equality, and so on. Right? This is the contradictory sort of experience. So you see the colonial leader, the master, as somehow split between these two dimensions. And the experience of living with such a master is not an easy one. It's not, you can't reconcile yourself easily to that kind of situation. And so these are the thinkers in whose thoughts the contradictions, the many paradoxes, the many conflictual engagements, the combination of desire, of love and of hatred, of resentment, all of these combine in a very peculiar mix of affects, right? That is, you cannot help, if you look at the 19th century discourse on the colonizer, it's predominantly a discourse of wonder, right? It says, wow, these people have really achieved something. That is, the Europeans. These thoughts, these ideas, they are so brilliant, they are so new, and we should absorb them, we should assimilate them, we should, make them our own. In the 19th century, a majority of Indian intellectuals were admirers of the thought of the new ideas, the modern ideas of the European world. And they knew very well that while the ideas were great, the British in India were not so great in what they were doing. That they knew it. But they separated the ideas from the people who were governing the right? In the 20th century, something new also comes into the mix, which is that this admiration becomes a kind of suppressed. It's there, it's still there, but it somehow cannot be spoken in earnest. You can't simply proclaim it in the way that they did in the 19th century. It becomes a little more psychically more complex kind of situation, right? Some kind of obligation to somehow state things differently comes into, begins to be felt. I mean, this is what I am presenting here is an overall sort of idea of a shift in intellectual temperament between these two periods, if you like. And one of the great sort of figures in this particular transition is Gandhi, and before him Tilak, Bala Gangadhar Tilak, another nationalist, who was the most powerful figure in the Congress before Gandhi came on the scene. So it becomes much more complicated. This whole idea, in the 19th century, it's very clear. The British who are ruling us are doing a lot of injustice. They are neglecting our requirements. They are draining our country of all its wealth. they are behaving in the most unenlightened way, right, here in our country. But the Europeans, including the British intellectuals like Mill or the French who had just made a revolution, great ideas, wonderful new things that we must learn from. So this was very clearly two separate parts of this. 20th century, as I said, there is a different kind of affective economy that comes into existence. Much more complicated, and but obviously there is another dimension to it, which is that the Congress Party, which was the leading force in the freedom movement, was a very ineffectual party in the 19th century, in the late 19th century. It was there. It used to be called a club of gentlemen, right? They did nothing very. They kept writing petitions and sending it and saying, you must do this. This is un-British, and you must change your attitude, and and so on. But they never had much contact with the masses of India. They were just arguing for themselves, basically. Only in the cities, the big cities, Calcutta, Bombay, etc. Whereas in the 20th century, obviously under Gandhi's leadership, it became a mass movement, right? People were mobilized beyond these urban limits, and this great enthusiasm was generated all across the subcontinent for a kind of a project of Swarajya, that is self-rule, right? So that is the contradiction, that you have a much more complicated process of psychic relation to the colonial. On the other hand, you have a much more effective, much more powerful movement that's also emerging. So that's a overall thing, overall sort of paradigmatic kind of shift that one has to see as as a historical in terms of defining the nature of 20th century as a historical period in India's life. So that is by way of a short introduction. And also, I mean, in terms of this course, maybe it's time, for us to maybe discuss what kind of say expectations, ideas people have, and what we should think of as activities in the coming weeks. Is that something that we can start now? Because I would then like to go into some of the a few ideas which are related to the first reading. But before that, can we do that? Is that a useful thing? What the plan which I had, which is basically a general approach to teaching graduate courses which I have back in my university, is to have a kind of lectures combined with student presentations and on the readings, and occasional discussions, and maybe even a couple of film screenings which are related to this question at some point, if there is time. Or even these films can be distributed, they can be watched outside class and discussed along with the readings. That's also possible. So the syllabus has been given in week by week form, and you will notice that some of them look as if there's a lot, but actually some of those readings are very short, 2 pages or 3 pages. So they're just sections which have been put together for that week. And where some particular section becomes interesting and somebody has, if all of us have a lot to say about it, we want to discuss it further, we can always keep it going for another week or for the next class, for part of the next class or so on. So there's no, it's not that we will just finish with one thing and move on to the next thing. You don't need to have it, for it to work like that. So it could also be that I cover some of the texts, the readings in my lectures, present them so that other, readings which are of greater interest and generate greater discussion can be given more space, more time. So we can be flexible on that front. So that's my sense that we can first of all discuss maybe the interest that what kind of things people would like this course to give them, and also to settle on that procedure, the presentations, etc. What I am doing here is not introducing necessarily the reading, the called Idea of India, which we will do again, when we have the text. All of you have the reader, we will go over it briefly. But what I'll do is give you a few pointers so that you can actually, the reading can actually be productive for you, right? And some of these issues will actually be not covered by Khilnani. I am putting some issues there for us to consider as a way of understanding the course as a whole, right? Because the question of thought brings into focus the question of the mind, the question, the decolonizing question, isn't it? So it's a question of thought under conditions which are not the ideal conditions, let us say, right? Because that's why we think that colonialism is a bad thing, is because in some ways it has some kind of distorting effect. Yeah, and so that's our suspicion in any case, right? But interestingly, of course, some people will say, the places, the most exciting thought comes from places which are actually undergoing some historical crisis or something like that. Who knows? This is not a paradox we want to solve now, but the question would be, what are the coordinates within which thought happens? There is a colonial pressure. That is, there is a government in place which rules by considering itself to be destined to rule these people, saying that we have our historical destiny is to rule them, develop them, make them mature, bring them up, to be proper human beings, right? That's the one of the founding justifications of empire, right? The empire is a burden placed upon the British by history, right? We know that. Now that's the thing. We know what impinges on the colonized mind, because the colonized mind has to respond to this, right? And the response was determined by the fact that the colonized subject actually found the ideas attractive, but did not find the idea of being somehow inferior unattractive. So you were attracted by some ideas, but to find yourself in a position which requires somebody to come and rule over you in order to develop you into better human beings seemed inherently somehow unacceptable, right? So this is your contradiction. Now, when Sunil Khilnani is writing this essay in 97, 50, its occasion is the 50th anniversary of Indian independence. So he writes a book which is called The Idea of India. And immediately this phrase caught on. Everybody now says idea of India, the idea of India. I don't know whether it was ever used, before Sunil Khilnani used it. I think one or two may have used it somewhere, but it is, after this book came out, it caught on. It became a very widely used phrase. Idea of India, idea of, everybody says, the idea of India. What happens to the idea of India? How can you do this? It is so detrimental to the idea of India, and so on. In every sentence, you get this idea of India as a thing. So that's why I've called this the idea of India. If you look at my things, how is this? What does it mean? So I first wondered, as a discursive analysis, if you like, you to do discourse analysis kind of object. So, for instance, in America, you have American Dream. The American dream is some kind of utopian idea of happiness, isn't it? How you can be, how America allows you to achieve, everything you want. It's a free country, it's America, so you can do whatever. You can, if you work hard, you can achieve. The American dream has certain components, Maybe it's a small town dream, maybe a nice big house with a lawn around it and, 2 children and parents, and the grandparents come to visit on Thanksgiving. This is some idea, isn't it? But they call it the American dream. Whereas the idea of India is not, it's a question, what relation there may be between these. And the other question is, do all countries have something like this? Is there something, say in Taiwan, the idea of Taiwan or the Taiwanese dream? Is there something like that? Or China, mainland, some ideal, some projection which sustains this entity, the land, the thing. France has an idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
What would that be? Well, how would you? Is there a phrase?
No, certain idea. I guess it's related to
The Republic, the Republic, French Republic. So the idea of the French Republican sort of ideal,
the human rights.
Human rights, yeah. But is there a way in which it figures in everyday language? No, it doesn't. So, the political. But idea of India is something which figures very frequently. Any other place? Anybody know anything about a place which anchors its identity to a phrase?
In Indonesia, we have a phrase in Bahasa. It's called Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. It translates into unity in diversity.
Unity in diversity. Yes, we have. Yeah, India has the same. Yes, you're right. Yes, Indonesia being a country with a comparable diversity to what we have in India, right? Many languages, many religions, and so on. So unity in diversity. Now that's a slogan which is specific to, say, Indonesia and in India also, right? This idea of unity in diversity. Now, so it's, if you look at the next one, it's about forging unity in the face of overwhelming diversity, right? That is, here is a country in which what is, see, the difference between European nation states and all these other colonial nation states is that European nation states are relatively homogeneous in terms of population, relatively. That is, by and large, they are of one, British, that is, the French are the French, the Germans are the German, there is a German speaking population, there is a French speaking population, and even further they will be Catholic or Protestant, etc. So, relative, historically, these countries achieved by various means a kind of homogeneous population within the, but colonial countries are not like that. You might have seen the history, how the history of say a country, a continent like Africa unfolded, right? Those, in Africa there are many countries which have these square, straight line borders, right? Those were borders drawn in one room, by the leaders of all these European countries, saying this much for me and that much for you, So you actually have countries, normally most countries in the world have crooked borders, all kinds of odd shapes. But you will see in Africa that certain countries have very neat borders. That means they were created on a map. They just took a map and said, that's mine, Belgium, that's French, like that. They shared Africa among themselves, right, in this fashion. Now that means that the people who are inside of those lines are anybody, whoever happens to be inside. Right? Because they didn't say, when you draw those straight lines, you don't draw the straight lines, you can't draw straight lines when you try to say, okay, let us keep the Tutsis in one country and the Hutus in another country and the Congolese in another country. If you say that, then your borders will be different. But first, if you say this much for me and that much for you, then obviously some Tutsis will be here, some will be there, some Congolese will be mixed up with them, some Arab population will be mixed up with the thing, and so on, right? So it's not a nation which is formed historically, that is over centuries or like that. It's formed arbitrarily, right? Arbitrary formation of nations. So after independence, what do? They have to live with each other, right? So they'll wake up and say, who's sitting next to me? Oh, some person. And then they say, okay, you have to live in the same house. So you have to somehow live with each other. This is how, this is the difference between older nation states and colonial nation states. This is the fundamental difference. In my part of the world, we have this, you might have seen that, how do I use this? So we have, we have this, whatever, I don't take, so there was partition, right? So some part of here, some part here. So this was India and this was Pakistan and this was also Pakistan. They had nothing in common, but only thing they had in common was they were both ruled by the British. So they made one country out of two regions where the distance is must be, I don't know, 2000 kilometers between them, nothing in common, but religion was common, Muslim and Muslim, but here there was a Kashmir, predominantly Muslim, but it became in part of India, and this part became part of Pakistan, right? You have such peculiarities. Now all this is because of colonialism, right? This is a colonial sort of, we have to take this question very seriously. This is the question of form. And content, right? So there is an entire important question which we might, I'll just note it here, we can discuss it throughout this course. Morphology, right? Whatever it is, politically speaking, morphology is about form question, right? Politically, what does it mean to have arbitrary political boundaries? Arbitrary political boundaries, right? That is, political boundaries which are generated by an abstract process which is not related to the social realities on the ground. It's a very important question, because it's not just that, you know, form is of no consequence. Form actually has great consequence, because then the nature of the independent existence, how well you can live together, how well the country can function, everything depends on questions that have to do with the morphological nature of what was. So the arbitrary question, arbitrariness of the political sort of entities that are brought into existence, right? We will go back to, to some of these issues throughout the course, because for instance, Partha Chatterjee's idea of, derived from Gramsci, the idea of passive revolution has something to do with this, right? Some countries, but passive revolution covers a lot of countries, but the more specific post-colonial nation problem, morphologically speaking, is something different, but they are related, passive revolution question and this morphological question, they are related. But the main thing to keep in mind is the difference between a nation state that comes into existence as a result of centuries of upheavals, problems faced by the people, new forces, new economic forces, modes of production changing, and democracy, ideas of democracy coming into existence, republican ideals appealing to the people, conflicts arising between different classes, etc. All of these give rise to some nation states. That is one history. That's a very anti-colonial wars, like America. America was a colony, but they fought against British rule and they became independent. And they also, in the same moment, they made an American Revolution, right? The American Revolution of 1776, the declaration, is the first of the revolutions. Immediately afterwards, there is the French Revolution and so on. Now, that is one kind of history which you have, two different types of formations. But what we are concerned with is the post-colonial nation. Now, for instance, a place like China, it doesn't belong to that, either of these models. It's something different. So that's why I'm leaving that one for, out of this picture, because it is not a place which you can say, like India, is arbitrarily composed of some place, some area which happened to be under Japanese rule or something like that. It's not, it's different, right? Its integrity is given by some other process. So we'll have to talk about how, what is the nature of that morphological sort of issue, how does it figure there, whether it's a nation state at all in the sense in which the European definition of the nation state is made, etc. But what I am defining is a smaller, but I mean they are not, it covers much of the world. These particular nation states, nation within quotes, nation states which were born out of colonial existence, that is, which emerged from colonial existence into freedom. And when I say colonial existence, again I say it means Western European colonial existence, because it is only there that this feature, the distinct feature of these nation states is that their contours, their geographical territorial contours are arbitrarily decided upon. Arbitrary determination of the contours. Now you can say some other places are also arbitrary in the sense that they go and conquer some other place, but that's conquest. That's a different thing. The people who conquer are not what we are talking about here, but those who come into existence as independent nations in a moment or after having struggled against colonial rule. So in those states, a certain significant role to the arbitrary dispositions of the people concerned. Now when we read Khilnani, he will cite this Radcliffe, Cyril Radcliffe. Cyril Radcliffe was a man who was living in England. He was told one day, you have to go to India. He said, why? Because we have to partition the country. So you have to go, you have to draw the line and you come back. So he went and he stayed 5 weeks in India. Cyril Radcliffe, a British geography expert, he stayed for 5 weeks in India, drew the line and went home. That's it. So to give you an idea of what this arbitrariness means, right? It's about, one of the things about these borders and lines is that in my life, these borders have played a very great role, actually. In my childhood, we used to cross between 2 states. My mother's village was in one state and my father's village was in another state. The distance was 6 kilometers. And as children, we were told that these are 2 different states and that there is a border. So every time we went, we used to say, now this time we have to see that border. Be alert, keep looking, don't forget it. So you look that side, I look this side, and so on. We will go on looking, and then we will say that, oh, the other state has come. Then we missed the border again. It used to happen frequently that you kept missing the border, and then everybody said there is a border. But our mothers and other people who accompanied us, they didn't know anything about the border. They said, where is the border? What border? Something. They didn't know what we were talking about because they are not educated. We were reading about it in the school, right? They didn't. So this borders thing, the arbitrariness of borders. I mean, the fact that my mother's village and my father's village both spoke the same language, but they were still in 2 different states. Arbitrarily, a line was drawn, right? So in that sense. So these are this is the question of borders. And anyway, the point being the arbitrariness of the whole thing and how that then has to be rationalized. So that's the question, right? The idea of India obviously means the idea of Pakistan also, you know. So it's even more difficult for them to have an idea of Pakistan. India, at least there is contiguity. You can somehow, you know, wing it, as they say. But imagine trying to get an idea of Pakistan going with those two parts. Obviously, it was very difficult, and in fact, it fell apart, you know. They were already apart, but they fell apart in the ideational sense, right? They became two different countries. So these are all the outcomes of the colonial experience, is what I'm trying to say. That this is the question of freedom, in other words, is also a question of coming to know yourself. In the long process, getting to know yourself. That is, if some of you familiar with psychoanalysis as a psychoanalytic ideas are very useful actually, because in psychoanalysis one of the things that is said is desire. This desire is a very, very treacherous thing, right? Because to begin with, you learn to desire by desiring or seeing what the other desires, right? So, for instance, there are two pens. So, two boys will be there and say, say, you take this one, you take this one. I take this one, but I look at that one. So, I want that one. No, for nothing, just because, you know, this thing. And but if that person says, hey, I like this one better, you know, hey, actually I like that one better, you give it to me, then you say, oh no, maybe like that. It's the other's desire is always serving as the model for how to desire. You learn to desire by looking at the desire of the other, right? This is the Lacanian idea of desire, right? So in that sense, psychopathology has to do with getting trapped in the desire of the other. That is, not being able to exit from this field of the other's desire. You know, permanently desiring only what the other desires, instead of learning to desire, you know, independently. That is recognizing self-knowledge. This is kind of idea that you can autonomize yourself in such a way that your desires are no longer subject to the desire of the other. So there is some thing, you know, to something on those lines which we can think about as possibly applying to these kind of post-colonial situations, right? In post-colonial situations, these nations, these are arbitrarily formed nations. So in some ways, the very formation of these countries, these rectangular countries of Africa and so on, they already have the desire of the other sort of inscribed in them, right? Because you didn't, Cyril Radcliffe, off he went, right? He was so scared. He said, he wrote to his son saying, you know, I'm going to draw this line and run from here. God knows what they'll do to me if they find out, you know, that I drew these lines, and so on. So the very contours, whether it is a map, whether it is the idea, or whatever it is, in the very coming to existence, already the other's desire is sort of providing inscribing itself in what is yours, right? So you are an independent nation. You think you say here is an independent entity, right? You assume that the autonomy of desire is also achieved, but that's not the case. That is a long process. That is why post-colonial existence is a time of learning to desire differently, self-knowledge which can discriminate, which can separate the other's desire from my own desire, right? So to know what freedom is and to actually achieve it is a process that begins at the time of independence. It doesn't end there, right? So that is one of the things that we must try and capture through these things is what are those pathways, the false routes taken by this desire for freedom, which leads back to the other's desire, right? That is, you think you are striking out independently, but again you are making your way back into the field of the other. The other's desire is setting the agenda for you long afterwards. That kind of an issue. Now, this is also a treacherous field. So, it means that it's not a question simply of rejecting everything that the other is all about. Is this not that? It's not like hating the other, removing all traces of the other's existence. That's not how you have to conceive it. It's a matter of self-knowledge insofar as that is, a decolonization does not mean eliminating colonial something. So, this is colonial, let us remove this from, then we will become decolonized. This is not like that. So, you have to again conceive freedom itself, what does it consist of in a non-positivistic sense, right? A sense which is not derived from positively identifying what is mine and what is somebody else's, but of understanding what it is to be who I am, today. So, we will also have occasion to go into this question of history and subjectivity, right? I am just making a note for myself because there is something I want to introduce later, right? Would anybody like to make any comments, questions, anything, any clarifications regarding what we have discussed so far? There was one interesting comment. I wish he had made the comment during class. Fred, who made 2 points actually, interesting, both relevant to this, which is the question of the name. When you talk about the desire of the other, the question of the name, which features in our readings. Sunil Khilnani actually talks about it. So I'm glad you brought it up. There is Indians learning to call themselves Indians. When did this happen? Although there are many references, it is said that the Greeks referred to India as Indica in the days of the ancient Greek civilization period. And the people of Western Asia, that is the Arabs and the Persians and so on, used to refer to it as Hind because of the river, Indus River and so on, Hind, Hind, Sind, and so on. And the British obviously picked up on that and coined the idea of the name India. Internally, the name is assumed by Indians only roughly in the late 19th century. So it's just about 100 plus years of this identity, which again, the question of the name becomes important because as I was saying earlier about the question of the desire question, the naming is one of those ways in which the newborn is actually incorporated into the society, isn't it? You give a name and the parents' desires are bestowed on the child, right? So in India, we have a lot of these problems of parents who want their children to be an engineer, a doctor, and so on. They decide, when, or they say, my son will marry your daughter when they grow up. They decide, fix it like that. All in many ways in which the desires of the parents are imposed upon the child. So in earlier social structures, that was the norm. So when it is the same for everybody, it's normal, isn't it? So it doesn't cause any disruption. Psychically, it doesn't cause any problems. But when it is exceptional, when only some people face that, then it's a problem, right? And so naming is also one of those things which we can take on as something that is part of the problem of identification. And it's an interesting problem in this Indian case, because in India, the name India is used by Indians only when they speak English. So, for instance, in the language of the Andhra Pradesh, in the Hyderabad where I come from, the people there do not call India, India. They say Bharat, Bharata, right? Or if you are speaking Hindi, you will say either Bharat or Hindustan. Hindustan is a Urdu, Persian kind of naming. Yeah? So, in most of the Indian languages, the word India is not used to refer to this country also. So, that again is an interesting question of names and desires and the relation between the name and the territory, the signifier and the signified, that how it works, isn't it? Which will come back, But another point Fred made, which I would like, if you can repeat it, about the idea of
when I first read this book, I think it's very interesting because it's been a lot of debate of identification, national identification here in the island. Then a popular book called the Imaginative, Imagine Community. And there's a lot of debate. But interesting is this book's title, The Idea of India. So India, basically, it is an idea. It is not a physical place or physical existence or positivistic denotation.
Right.
It's something connoted. So between denotation and connotation, it is a very interesting, free, the whole idea of identity. So I just come back to one of our teachers, Chen Xingzhu, his idea. He talked about ancient Chinese philosophy, talk about China, Zhongguo. Zhongguo is not a place. Zhongguo is an idea. Because in our ancient Saint book called 中国是圣人之所在. China is where the saint is. So wherever there is a saint, the place qualified to be called Zhongguo.
Mm-hmm.
So Zhongguo has been in Japan because after Ming Dynasty, all Confucian scholars seem to be major move to Japan. So the Japanese at one time consider themselves Zhongguo because they have the saint. And the China saint already disappeared, being occupied by the barbarian called Qing Dynasty. So the Japanese hate the Ming Dynasty. People cannot overthrow the Qing Dynasty, so they become the Zhongguo. And also for some sect of the Buddhists, Zhongguo is India.
Okay.
Okay. For them, there is where the same is, or where is the same from. So Zhongguo is India. So it's a very interesting. Because Zhongguo can be Japan, Zhongguo can be India. So I think
That's a, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a totally deterritorializes the concept and makes it movable. But how does it reconcile with the modern territorial entity? That's your thing.
yeah.
So obviously some change has happened in terms of how that concept is now grounded.
Grounded, and it becomes a geopolitical
Yeah,
concept
yeah.
rather than an idea.
Yeah.
That's your form in the context.
Right, the
It totally
relation
becomes
between.
a morphology.
Yes. No, in a certain sense, all names are ideas. In the sense that even though we say that, say, a country like France has emerged in a historical time to be what it is, and or Germany or Italy, the relation between the name and the actual place remains that of an idea. But the difference is how much of a compact, a tight fit has been achieved between the name and the territory. That is a historical fact. It's not that those are not ideas. Every naming of a country is an idea, but the prevalence of the idea, a strong, where you still are talking about the idea as if it were somehow not quite, fitting. So there is a gap. When you perceive the gap, that is when the idea becomes more prominent. When you don't perceive a gap, the idea has in some ways become absorbed into some other formation.
So would you say the whole idea of the words in English India is basically an imperial misconception? So they call it West India. That's absolutely nothing to do
Right,
with
yeah,
India,
yeah.
because they mix up. Okay, then you have this term very funny, American Indian.
That's right, yeah. That was a.
Then you have Indian American. Indian American is the Indian immigrant in America.
Yeah.
So how you distinguish two terms totally disrelated.
Yeah, the confusions there are many. That is. So anyway, so these are some of the questions we can come back to. But to go back to this page that I earlier asked you to open up, the meaning of freedom, this particular part of the notes. How to define freedom, because all of these texts that we will read will discuss freedom in different senses of the term, obviously. For instance, to begin with, is the meaning of freedom to be understood socially or politically? Or both, obviously. You can say both meanings have to be there. But there is also a history of people assuming that political is more important than the social, or social is more important than political. What does that mean? Basically, it means whether you define freedom in terms of who rules the country, whether the rulers belong to the country in which they are ruling. That means foreign rule, alien rule, right? So that's one freedom. Right? The second idea is that of freedom understood in the historical sense of modern, are people free from oppression, feudalism, other kinds of tutelage, in the Enlightenment sense of the term, liberty. That is, it has to be defined as a social, on a social basis, and it has to be achieved politically, but the meaning of it has there is a social dimension to the meaning. In other words, if it's a purely political meaning, it means you can, once the foreign ruler has gone, you are free, even if your native ruler is a king. It doesn't matter. But the other meaning is that freedom means only if you achieve modern, democratic equality, liberty in the modern sense. So, the two things. Now, in India, as you are aware, there are two historical events. Freedom in India was achieved in two different dates. These are the two dates. Most people, most of the time we say, when did India become an independent country, free colonial rule? 1947. What happened in 1950? In 1950, India adopted a constitution and declared itself to be a republic, a democratic, sovereign republic in which all citizens have the right to vote and are equal. Right? So, this is two different freedoms. There is a gap between August 1947 and January 1950, 2.5 years interim gap. So, which is the real freedom? This is another question. That is, did you become free at that point? Because what happens is, in 1947 the British left India. After that, there was an interim rule. Indians were ruling, but some parts of India were ruled by princes, kings, and Nizam, sultans, etc., Nawabs, etc., Raja, right? So, in other words, it was free in one sense, but not free in the other sense. 1950, what happens is, all of these parts are integrated together, and they say that now the new country called India, that is Bharat or Hindustan, will be a democratic republic in which all citizens are equal regardless of caste, creed, religion, gender, etc. Right? So, this duality is an interesting duality, because depending on which one you emphasize, your attitude to freedom itself is different. Your approach to freedom, your understanding of freedom is different according to which of these you think is more important. And if you do, if you read about Indian, freedom in this text that we are reading, if you read about these issues, you will see that actually some people focus more on the 47 freedom. That's it, and so on. Whereas others will say freedom comes only with this other thing. So, that is why I have the number 3 in this list. Is freedom historical or geo-cultural? Geocultural means this geography, this place. This place has a distinct culture. The British are foreigners and they should not be here ruling. It is historical. We have been ruled by imperialists, rajas, nawabs, etc. Now we shall not be ruled by such one, one powerful man or woman, mostly men, ruling in kingdoms and other kinds of older political forms, in terms of political morphology, right? Individual or collective, number 2. This is also a very pressing question in India, because in India many people will say Indians have a are like to be members of communities. They are not interested in individual freedom. Is a Western concept. Indians are by nature not very happy with individualism, right? This is one issue. I think this happens in more places than India, but anyway, in India there is a lot of emphasis on collective identities and not individual identities. So if somebody says, well, you say that India is a free country, but why can't I do as I want, please? They'll say, but you cannot, you have to be a member of your community, your collective, and not individual, right? So that is, so the idea is that individualism is Western, and so Indian, for Indians, a collective identity is more important. Another axis of difference is what I am calling here recovering lost being or emerging into renewed becoming. That is, when you become free, are you becoming once again what you were before the British came and occupied? You are recovering the old identity, or is it that you have now become something new? You've changed, and your new identity is a historically determined identity and not something which is old. It's not that you go back to what you were before. Yeah. So this is another question we have to talk. To what extent is it about recovering old identity, and to what extent is it about a new identity which is, in which colonialism also plays a part? Right? So colonialism is not like some external cage. You open it, you come out, and then you are the same again, right? It's something else. It's more internal. It's more something that changes you from inside, so that when you free yourself from colonialism, you are not that old person, but some new person, right? That idea. Now, the reason why that's important is the next thing here. In the readings that we are going to read, in this coming weeks, and in many readings about India in the colonial period and even in the post-colonial period, there are a lot of Indians who write sentences which say, India is dash dash dash, or Indians are dash dash dash. General statements. India is a land of villages. India is a very religious country. Indians are by nature very pious. Indians are like so and so. Indians tend to be like this. So, the language of being is are tend to be this language. This we have to examine. We'll see how does that work, and it's always a comparative thing. It's interesting to compare and ask how often do such statements are such statements made in other countries. Can anyone say in their particular countries whether they often frequently make statements like Indonesia is, Indonesians are, or Malay,
Lazy. Lazy. They are not diligent.
Religion,
Lazy.
lazy.
Not hardworking.
Okay. About
Malay.
Malays. Acha. Okay, that's a characterization, right? That is, you say Malaysians are lazy or Malays are lazy. That kind of statement, yes, many people make. Like within India, I will say Punjabis are very enterprising. Malayalis are very educated, and hardworking, again enterprising or whatever. Kannadigas are very lazy, right? They don't, and so on. No, that is mostly saying something about other people. It's a kind of stereotype. This is not stereotype. This is more like the people saying, and they are saying positive things. What they consider positive things. It's not that it's a denigration. But but basically what is important here is the language, that the is language, which says something which is that you are, in essence, you are like that. And it's not said by the British. The British said all kinds of things. Indians are backward, Indians are lazy, Indians are immature, they need to be, they don't know, they have not achieved anything, all kinds of things. That is different. That is, they justified their own rule by, making denigrating comments about the people whom they ruled, right? There is a whole history to that we can also, but this is said by Indian, like for instance Gandhi will say it, Nehru will say it, or Tagore will say it, or somebody, Indians will say it in what they consider to be positive way. That is, so the question would be, in what ways does, what enables people to say such things? What are the conditions under which you can say such things?
In the other Indian language, they also with this kind of grammatical structure.
No.
Also in English, to be is naturalizing.
Yes.
Naturalizing.
Yeah.
Okay. So you don't have to ask questions. There's no reason. So there.
Right.
Is this.
Right.
But in the other Indian language,
No.
may not.
They may not. You are right. The language question is very important. You are absolutely right. It's a matter of speaking, what language you speak, and now you can be, I think we are beginning to see how important the language issue is to all of these processes, the whole question of freedom, etc., that we are discussing, and how it gets enmeshed in every dimension of the freedom question, right? Subject. The freedom question becomes a subject question, isn't it? As subjects, you begin to see that there is an experience of duality. That is, you can do certain things in English, you cannot, or you don't do certain things in the vernaculars. There's some difference, there's some sharing, division of labor between these two levels, right? That is meant for certain things and the other language is meant for certain other things. That kind of a duality. So the duality is also a consistent feature of India ever since the colonial occupation, and it has continued to be a feature even afterwards. And we have to, in the spirit of self-knowledge, we have to ask that question also. That will be an interesting, actually I am interested in the Indonesian case, because Indonesia made a very interesting shift in terms of language. They also used a language which is not a native language, but which they choose and said this will be our language. And so they also have a duality, but I am not aware how that duality operates in practice, and it would be interesting to know more about that. And in any other instance where a dual system linguistic order exists, but has something different about it than what it is in India, for instance, or Africa, for instance. Africa is also somewhat, I don't know, different. For instance, Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, right? English or French as they have adopted English or French as the national language, but they also have the other languages. How that duality operates and how it enables or disenables freedom and so on, you know. And because one of the things we know about language, the political question of language is that in ancient political structures, that is monarchies and empires, there was always a separation of the language of the rulers and the language of the people. It was a necessary duality in those days. Correct? In India, for instance, Sanskrit was the language of rulers. So all your administration and your literature and your religious practices, all of these took place in Sanskrit. People spoke many different languages. They are known as Prakrits. So Prakrit actually means natural, that is non-refined. Sanskrit means refined. So basically the refined language for various functions and a variety of natural languages. What it means basically is grammatically languages which have no written grammars, right? Like Dante, the Italian poet, he wrote an essay called the eloquence of eloquence in the vernacular, vulgar, eloquentia vulgari, which means eloquence in the vernacular or vulgar tongue, in which he talked about how the grammatical language called Latin, and he compared it to the non-grammatical languages like Italian, and said how and he was asking people to adopt this other language, Italian, in order to constitute a new kind of community and to write in that language. And he himself went on to write in that language. In fact, some people say that Dante was writing this essay and he stops in the middle of a sentence. That text, it's in the middle of a sentence, it stopped. He didn't write. He went on and he just wrote the poetry. He said, why write an essay when I can actually show by writing in Italian. So that kind of a distinction, which is historically very important, whether societies are using the language of the people or they are using a separate language for administration and other requirements. Mustafa Safwan, an Egyptian writer, he has a book called Why Are the Arabs Not Free? And it's a very small book of short essays, in which his idea is that all over the Arab world, Egypt, the language of Egypt is different from the language of Syria, and it's different from the language of Yemen, and it's different from the language of Saudi Arabia or Sudan. The Arabic, they are all Arabic, but they all share a classical Arabic which is common to all of them, but in each country the demotic, that is the language, the people's language, is different. And you can't comprehend the two both. That is, to understand, so an Egyptian cannot understand the Arabic spoken by the demotic of Syria so easily. It's different. Like Latin, Italy, Italian or French, there are some similarities, but it's not the same. So classical Arabic constitutes the common shared language in which everybody writes in that language. So the Syrian text can be understood by the Egyptian, etc. So on that level there is uniformity. And tries to argue that there is some relation between this order and the kind of despotic or dictatorial regimes that the Arabic world has seen. Anyway, that's again a question of freedom, actually interesting sort of thing to explore, and specifically in the question of language. So the question then becomes one of whether the political definition of freedom has to incorporate the question of language in it, or whether it's optional. Language is an optional element that you can or cannot have. Then you have the question of the related question of democracy. I mean, it's obviously, can you have democracy without that kind of a linguistic sort of decision about language? Because in India we do have a democratic system, we have a federal system, and while English is the language of the national, it's very similar to what Safwan discusses in the Arab world, but it's also different in the sense that Indian democracy does operate fairly well in the state level. In the sense, at state level, people's participation in democratic process is extremely enthusiastic and high level of participation in the provinces. The thing that people are noticing is that when it comes to the national level, the participation is very low. So there are two types of elections. State election, lots of fighting, debates and discussions and conflicts between this and that thing, parties and so on. Feverish campaigning, large crowds, splashing, their messages across the parties' messages across the thing, and great participation. But when it comes to national, the national election is always ends up being a coalition, because it's not possible, at least in the last 20 years at least, after Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi, that era, after that, India has been a place for coalition governments. That means multi-party governments. So after the elections, I get out of 520, let us say, you have to get 260, 270 seats, 500 and something, 26 or something. 270 seats, I get 150, 180. Then there is one party here from one province which has some 10 seats, another one from there 5 seats, another one 15 seats. So all get together and form a national government. So the national government is never, in the last so many decades, national governments have never been popularly elected governments in the direct sense. Only state governments are, so democracy is operating full scale very effectively at state level, but not at the national level. So, this is an interesting political question about how democracy functions in relation to language, region, ethnicity, etc., which again will come up in. So, Yogendra, the CSDS, which we were talking about earlier. See, in CSDS there is a whole team which studies elections specifically, and they are the ones who put forward this idea that, you know, that in the national election has ceased to be a popular mandate. The national government has not had a popular mandate, a direct popular mandate for so many decades, for so many elections. So, as a serious sort of interesting development in Indian politics. Of course, why is it the case? Now, if you look at the history of India, you have Jawaharlal Nehru in the wake of freedom for about 47 to 64, and with a small gap then you have Indira Gandhi. Now, after that is the period of coalitions. Before that, Congress used to get a direct majority roughly in all the elections and come back to power. Now, some people say Jawaharlal Nehru's period is the post-independence period, so Congress still had some, the memory of, colonial rule, and Jawaharlal Nehru was a very towering figure, internationally known, etc. After that, Indira Gandhi her national popularity was very strong. She was a very powerful leader who could command votes all across India from ordinary people, but her appeal was charismatic appeal, right? So, if you look at Indian debates about national mandate, everybody talks about charisma. That is, without a power figure, it is not possible to get a mandate, direct mandate from the people at the national level. So, Indira Gandhi, ever since then, Congress party is constantly going back to Indira Gandhi's family, because it's the only family which has that charismatic thing. Now, today, Rajiv Gandhi came back, right? Today, we have a new contender. His name is Narendra Modi. He is from the Hindu Nationalist Party, and he is trying to build up the kind of charisma that in the past only somebody like Indira Gandhi had. Because at the national level, only an appeal to something like, religious or other kinds of extra power you need in order to get the votes, right? So, this is a question, the question of the mandates at the state level and the mandates at the national level. What is the reason for this difference, and what is the role of charisma in overcoming the difficulties faced by national parties in securing a mandate for themselves, right? So, the freedom question again sort of at this level becomes a matter of party which is so powerful, right, and so on. There are many issues that come up. For instance, some political scientists like Rajiv Bhargava and others will argue that Indian secularism is different from Western secularism. Because instead of saying that the state has nothing to do with religion, in India the state says all religions are good, all religions are equal, give equal respect to all religions. So there is no denial of religion. Now, of course, we can argue about whether in fact all secularisms are like that, because even the American state doesn't, they have separation of church and state, but everywhere in their American, on the dollar bill they say in God we trust and all those things. So which God, they don't say Jesus or anything, they don't specify which denomination, but they have a abstract concept of God, isn't it? So it's like secularism question in India has to do with whether the state is capable of not being influenced by religions, religious leaders. Because the influence of religious leaders on matters in India, on matters of statecraft or administration of government has been very powerful. That is, for instance, one of the things that the Hindu party always raises is the uniform civil code. That is, if you are one country, you have to have the same rules for marriage and other activities. But in India, we don't have that, because the Muslims have their own civil code, the Hindus have their own civil code, and certain rules for property, family related property. Hindu families have different rules for how they distribute their property. Christians have their own, and so on. So Hindu party, this BJP, demands that you should have one civil code for everybody, right? You should force the Muslims also to adopt the same norm. But Congress has resisted this so far, and most parties will say this should be left to them, to the communities concerned. So this is again a debate which is of great importance, the civil code question, which is related to the secularism question. Caste. Now, caste is one of those things, every Indian is ashamed of the caste question. We would rather not talk about it, but it won't go away. It is there. For a long time, in fact, Indians never talked about it. If you look at the intellectual sort of productions of the up to the 80s, you will not see much reference to caste. People will refer to it as, oh, that unfortunate caste thing which we had, it's gone, and so on. But in fact, it's not gone anywhere. It is very much there. And if you take the project of freedom seriously, you have to confront all the ugly facts about your society. You can't wish it away. You can't hide it. So there's a new, in the last 20 years, there's been a new energy to the critical engagement with the caste question. So now everybody talks about caste, to talk about what has gone wrong. Why is caste persisting in spite of 60 odd years of independence? This, there is a very energetic sort of debate going on about the caste question, and it is one of the most important things today, because it has been brought back onto the intellectual agenda after a long gap, and it has been facilitated by the emergence of Dalit movement, the movement of the lower castes in India, who have found a voice for themselves today, right? Because they now can actually articulate their own identities and their own demands, etc., in a way that was not possible for a long time. Even though they have had leaders who are very powerful, very influential people, but that was some time ago. In between, after independence, there was a gap when there was no big leader of the lower caste groups. But today, even today there are no big leaders, there are some leaders, but what is more important is that the lower castes have achieved a certain amount of public presence. They have in institutions, in the universities, in government, and in other kinds of locations where it matters, in the positions. Institutionally, they have acquired a presence, so they are able to articulate their views and so on. So the caste question has come back onto the agenda. So the question primarily about caste is, how does it survive? We know that caste, in the old society, caste was a different thing. It was hierarchy which was imposed on everybody. You have to follow, you have to live according to your station. You are determined. You can do certain things, you cannot do certain things. And it was a very, very ugly thing, very cruel kind of system. So there were people who would say, if the shadow of a lower caste falls on the body of the upper caste, it's some pollution, and so on. So it was a very, very intense and extreme, right? Now, obviously, those extreme forms do not exist, even though in the rural areas the caste relations are very tense and very violent. But by and large, you can say that the old system doesn't exist in its pure form. It's not there. But still it is there in some form. So the question would be, what are the new ways in which the caste actually persists in the social, in the social levels, and in determining the political order and so on. And how people have found, for instance, there are political parties now which represent lower caste groups, the scheduled castes and the backward castes, etc. And so the whole political field has become transformed by this developments of the last. So those will again feature in more. And there are some stories that I have picked, some essays and stories, which because the caste question has to be grasped in its everyday on the site of everyday life. That's where it's the reality of caste is. So I thought stories will be a good way to get some of them. Stories and essays. Right. So that is, I've listed something called political existence or inexistence, which has again to do with having assumed a democratic, having adopted a democratic constitution. We as an Indian, as a nation, were giving ourselves the task of realizing democracy, right? And that's what we have been doing for the last so many decades. But we cannot say till today that the project is complete. That is, what I mean by political existence means the question of whether symbolic equality. See, parliamentary democracy is not substantial equality. It's not what the communists call equality, which is equality in the economic sense. Democracy gives symbolic equality. That is, you may be rich, I may be poor, but there is no difference between you and me as far as the state is concerned, as far as public life is concerned, right? That is the equality. But just because it's symbolic, it's not unimportant. Symbolic equality actually makes a difference. It makes all the difference between social hierarchies of the old kind and a modern existence. So in that sense, political existence or political inexistence, as I call it here, is basically about actually achieving existence in that political domain called democratic republic that India has actually ceased to be. So it's a question of freedom again. Freedom in this very concrete definition of freedom that I am assuming here is, freedom means achieving political existence. which means that you actually can say that every Indian is able to say, yes, I am poor, or I am from some so and so caste or so and so religion, or whatever, from a region, but I know and I can feel, I actually think that I am equal to everybody else. That is what I would define as achieving political existence. And on that front, India is still working towards something like that, far from achieving it. And so that will in some ways frame our discussions in the next few weeks. That is, the question of political existence and what are these different things that the block the achievement of that, that come in the way of achieving political existence. So the discussion of freedom will then therefore happen at that level. Okay, so that's about what I had for today. We could now discuss any ideas that you have, any suggestions, anything that you would like. As I mean, we are all aware that the readers have not been available to you so far, but any other questions that you have, or other things that you want to share. As I said, the comparative frame is one of those things enabled by a group like this, and I'd be very happy if we can actually achieve that by bringing different experiences from different nationalities to bear on this question of freedom. What freedom means in different locations, and what are the for each of these issues that I have raised, what are the corresponding things, or what are the alternatives that other locations might proffer to us. Yeah.
So, first, thank you for imaging interesting of India as a post-colonial social entity. Seems to me that if you are speaking about those things, about the rising the India as a post-colonial state, you are a little bit neglecting, those elites, those native elites in India, because even the British, they couldn't rule India directly. They need those elites.
Yeah.
So then, if you are speaking about the rising the India in those colonial boundaries, then it must be actually decision, or at least the India must be created in those boundaries in which comfort with those elites, right? So
Yeah.
can you a little bit more express or explain the role of these elites in this process of nation or post-colonial India as a social entity? And then, if you are speaking about those phenomena as a freedom and identity, it seems to me that you are mixing identity and freedom together. So, is there some causal relationship between those two notions? Because you are speaking about the geopolitical, cultural, or historical freedom, then freedom or individual and collective individual and collective identity. So then it seems to me that you are mixing several different terms together. So can you a little bit more?
Time free. Okay. Yeah. No, that's the question of freedom. Like I said, 47 and 50. These are important dates because 47. The idea of freedom, which is associated with 47, is freedom as identity, recovering identity. So, in an interesting way, this is a definition of freedom that has been there in the history. That is, people say freedom is for me to recover become who I am again. Right? So, I am not advocating it. I am saying this is one of the things, Why is it there? Why is that freedom considered more important by some people than this freedom, which is a political freedom, more concretely defined as a freedom in terms of equality, liberty, and all of these kinds of new ideas. Right?
Well, I can understand you, but what I would like to suggest is that it seems to me that in your speech you are avoiding these words as a nationalism or the modern nation state. I can understand you why, but I don't want to accuse you from something, you know. So I think you maybe consider India as not a modern nation state, even possibly not as a state, right? Possibly it has something to do something to do with those old empires and so on and so on. But I can understand you, but that's quite important, because if we will speak about the modern nationalism, then the egalitarianism, that is actually the 1950s. It's very important. Just only people who are equal can feel as a member of one group. You know, that's, you know, so I can understand. So what I'm speaking about, that it seems to me that you are very carefully avoiding those words, modern nations. Why?
No, I'm not at all. They say because this entire thing is about the nation. It's forming. 1950 is a nation formation, nation state, which defines itself as a modern, egalitarian, republican sort of entity. Now the question is whether this kind of nation state, which has a history of colonization, right, which becomes free after colonization, what kind of internal problems, internal issues emerge for talking about freedom. Now the elite question is important here, that what the first one that you said. Now obviously, so for instance this language issue which I raised, English and the vernaculars, this is it's an elite question. It's the relation between the elite of India and the rest, right? In the sense that there is a way in which the relation between the elite and subaltern, elite and the dominated or the regional, the parochial or provincial, whatever sections, the relation is somehow inscribed in language also. So language has an economic role, a social role, and a role as a communicative medium here. So it has many dimensions. So that's why it's so how does India, elite, see, if you take a province, even the province has its own elite. But that elite is different from the national elite. That is, at the India level there is an elite. There is an elite at the India level, and there is an elite in every province. So there is a relation of multiple layered relation, and it is also to be asked why that is the case. So why isn't there a more homogeneous sort of relation between classes, different classes in one society, right? That's one of the expectations. If you look at sociological and other kinds of writings, they write with the expectation that a society means it will be divided into classes. But we do have class differences, but they are not across the continent, subcontinent. Not that India has one class, elite class and subaltern class and middle class. India has one kind of, there is an Indian segment which has its own divisions, and then there are regional formations where there is again another elite. That elite has very little influence on the national elite, but within the province they are powerful. So those are some of the issues. And the other question is, obviously the Indian elite is a very high performing elite. It's absolutely successful all over the world in many fields, right? And we all know that it is because of this continuity of English language education and all of these things which has enabled this for the elite of India. And in fact, they'll say, how now there are people who say we were lucky to be colonized by the British because now we have English and we can play the world economy better than other people. But of course, English became a dominant world language because India was colonized, not that so there are contradictions there, and the class, the ruling elite of India, right? One has to. I mean, some of the readings will allow us to see how it was formed. Where has it come from? It's not a classical, what you might call bourgeoisie. It doesn't have the qualities of the bourgeoisie as we understand it in terms of, say, Western experience, because it is not there's no industrial bourgeoisie in India. Like what Weber calls the Protestant work ethic, which generated the savings which went into economic activities, which then generated this whole antagonism towards the aristocracy. So the aristocracy was sort of combated, fought, and the monarchic state was made to change its whole structure in order to incorporate the new bourgeois sort of sentiment, all of these kinds of things. Many Indians actually write about India as if it has an industrial national bourgeoisie, but actually it doesn't. Indian bourgeoisie is basically a colonial bourgeoisie formed in the colonial period, and essentially what is it? It is the people in the bureaucracy and the professional people. This is the core of the Indian, what you might call, if you at all call it, the bourgeoisie. It is not the bourgeoisie in the classical sense at all, and therefore it has a particular character. It's very much a service-oriented bourgeoisie. It works by placing itself between the people and the foreign powers. So that way, the elite is absolutely important, and its role in building the nation is it wants to build the nation in its own, to serve its own interests, and that's what it is doing. But the elite is also functioning within a formation which is not of its own making. So the elite has not succeeded in fully remaking the Indian society in its own image. It is still subject to various kinds of colonial sort of after effects. That would what I would say about it. So the modern, it's interesting. Why would you, in the sense of modern nation state, could you elaborate why you think I was avoiding that?
If you will speak about that, you are speaking about the language, about the freedom in the society.
Right.
So this is just a kind of components of the modern.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I get it.
Modern,
Yeah.
You are putting them together.
Yeah.
So that's what I was interested.
Yeah. No, those are the components. So the idea is that, I guess what I'm trying to get at is we have to, the reason I went into the arbitrariness of political form, right, which is a distinctive feature of all post-colonial nation states, right, is the arbitrariness of political form and the kind of mixed desires that go into making it. So they are modern nation states in that way, but they are somehow, the desire of the other is so deeply inscribed in them that there is a difficulty which is internally experienced. That is, when you live inside, you experience the difficulties which have to do with that peculiarity of its coming into existence. So, in that sense, many things about India are like modern nation state experience things, but many things are not also. And so, what I am doing possibly, which prompts that response, is that I am keeping the question of India's political identity in abeyance. I am putting it aside for the moment to see if we can actually arrive at a more accurate understanding of the political character of the thing called India, which doesn't require us to use an already ready-made terminology, because it is and it is not a modern nation state. It is, in the sense, everybody has to be a modern nation state in current world. That is, without, there is no exception. Everybody is forced to be a nation, right? But just as I'm sorry for using individual sort of analogies, but human beings are also, we often experience that I come from a village in somewhere, I go to the city, I experience the individualism of the city, right? I have to fill forms, I have to do all of the things, but I am not temperamentally that person, because I don't recognize. For instance, in to give another example, in India, if even 20 years back, or even now maybe, if you ask somebody, what caste are you? That person says, we are of this caste. That is, you say, I am of that caste. Where if you say, if I come here and you ask me, which country are you? You say, I am from India. I am an Indian, right? But there is a way in which, supposing if you were to ask me which nationality are you, and I were to say, we are Indians, right? Actually, people give that response. So it's a person with a collective identity who is being asked an individualistic question. See, that discrepancy is an interesting one, because it happens in real life. And similarly, what I feel is, and I think you caught something there, which I feel is the result of saying, what is, while being nation state, because such is the requirement of the modern world, what is it about these kinds of post-colonial entities which is somehow not quite fitting into that, and therefore being experienced in many ways, in many painful ways, by the people who live that life. So yeah, but that's actually interesting that it should have manifested itself in some ways. But yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to address both of you by responding. Actually, I think the question is asking basically the nature of discourse over your
okay.
over these 6 months. So the question I understand is being why and how study the situation of Indian being pedagogical. Being pedagogical. Why it is important is pedagogical to learn things from
Okay.
India.
Okay.
I think that's the question. Okay. My answer is that because what's in the academic field, things are too clear, too neat, too stereotypical. And the Indians stand out as a case. It is, and it is, yet it is not exactly like that. For instance, the elite rule. In 1947, can be a moment of emancipation because the regime, all these kings used to be the vessel of empire. Then they've been free, at least for 2.5 years. it is historically, it has its importance. They gain back their historical significance as a cultural signifier during it. Then, very fast, in 2.5 years, you constitutionalize. Okay, but doesn't mean after you constitutionalize the cultural legitimacy and the Berber, okay, in the city, all those intermediate or mediating rules, okay, stop to exist. It still exists in the party situation, in the non-party politics.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think what's important here is that, okay, the complicated situation in India on the ground, including the caste system that is pedagogical, led us to think about we would like our history to be more clean or neat or go democratization, just step like that. Okay, we have to think. Okay, maybe the way of expectation ourselves is problematic. Okay, no such easy and neat process and a textbook version of a class division and the proletarian revolution.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, there is no way. There is no.
That's what
There's
seems
no.
to be the function and we are addressing.
It's a
I
sing.
don't know whether I understand you right. That's how I understand.
Well, can I say something?
Yeah.
I think I read the first article. I don't know whether how many of you have read. This is an intro session. I think we need to have shared reading. It's easier to
correct.
pose question from that angle. And it's quite helpful. I mean, how concrete historical content these things in what is Indian get multi-layered and failed. It was a political imagination by the political leaders and so on. This actually explains the entire process, right? And why things cannot be understood in purely constitutional in the civic civic nation state sense. And that would be neat. Then all the problem will be resolved.
So that there would be no.
Right?
Yeah.
So even like this is really ahead of discussion. I mean, in a way to use reductionist term, my suspicion is modern, so-called modern nation state or the modern understanding of the class immediately clash or intersect with the question of the caste.
Yeah.
Right? And how do you conceptualize in certain instances, like the example you draw, when the British ruling colonial period actually pulled out certain people, almost installed out of the blue, but a different kind of class, but you wouldn't say caste. But the question that has been obvious, if these are the ruling elites, how does that intersect with the caste question in actuality? But people don't want to look at it analytically. But it means there's all these things, even analytical tool, whether it's in place. So I guess all I'm saying, in a way, it's not easy at this moment to get into all the.
No, I mean it's we have the entire course.
So I guess one, because I'm trying to before the end of the session, we need to at least move forward with how to organize.
Yes.
For instance, are we going to get into the first, according to the syllabus, the first week, or start the second week? I think by next session, even prior to that, people should be able to get in.
Yes. I think Kobe was telling me that by Monday they'll get it, right? By Monday.
Yeah.
So by Monday the readings will be available.
You have to decide when
Yes.
the
So my
material for
my understanding was that since today I have talked about some of the things that Sunil Khilnani talks about, and since we are losing, this is the second week actually of the one, last week was a holiday. So I thought we will go into the second week's readings. We read the first one for, I would like to briefly go back to Khilnani next week to look at again at some of the details of what he is saying, because it's a very good essay to orient ourselves to the whole course. In the sense, he gives you an overall perspective, in which everything is featured, in small, there are references to all the issues that we are going to be discussing. So it's a good thing to orient yourself. So I would suggest that we read that. We will, in the beginning of the class, spend half an hour to 40 minutes talking about that. After that, we will go to the next set, which is again small essays. Again, this is part of the background. So we can start student presentations for the following week, but next week again we'll have discussion based on the readings, and hopefully because the readings will be available, more people will have things to say, questions. Please do come with questions and comments.
The reading will be the middle class in colonial India.
That's right. It's a set of small essays, 2 or 3 pages each. So they give you a kind of idea of the this class, the one that we were talking about a moment ago, which is the ruling class, if you like, of India. And what is
the only confusion is for instance, the Padachaji essay was actually printed at the end of this section.
Yeah.
Or the Gandhi essay for the third week.
Yeah.
So people need to know, otherwise they wouldn't be able to find where it's where.
No, that's true. It's there. It should be there.
It's there,
yeah.
but it's not in the order.
Right. Yeah, it's not the order. Maybe may not be correct, but it's all the material before Gandhi. Right, and also the Gandhi section. The first page, Kobe, the first page is double printed. Can you? The Gandhi section. The preface to the English edition is over, there's some double, that one. That has to be, a page has to be circulated. But for next week, it is the middle class readings. Yeah. So Khilnani and the middle class readings. After that, it will be one section at a time. Okay.